Want your brand to be seen and be remembered? Effective campaigns need both. JC.co's high-quality billboard sites in premium locations nationwide offer brands powerful and visible stages for emotive, impactful and influential storytelling. Find out how JC.co can help your brand be seen and be remembered at www.beseenberemembered.co.nz. Nau mai, hoki mai ki Otherfold, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Greive, tōku ingoa. Joined by Glen Kyne again this week to grapple with a bunch of stories which have sort of leapt out to me over the past few days, while also feeling like they haven't had anything like the kind of impact they deserve. They come in two broad buckets. One is about distribution, the platforms where we access things and what we're accessing, and the other about the increasing encroachment of AI onto platforms, I suppose, is what you'd say, and potentially a form of resistance to it. So welcome, Glenn.
Good morning, Duncan.
These are obviously the kinds of stories that are of abiding interest to us. And the thing that they both represent to me as sort of strands is it's not insidious isn't the right word, but there's something about the way that these things are just sort of marching on, and the kind of constant drumbeat of AI storylines for the first few years has more been about the theory of what it might do than the practical application, what it is doing. And this is the sort of, it feels like collectively a kind of inflection point.
Feels like
in some ways
an almost experimental, but not quite experimental evolution of what the next media operating models are going to start to look like.
Yeah, potentially. So we'll start with the distribution piece, because this is actually, I think, the biggest story of the year that has made the smallest splash. So I'll just read. This is reporting from Deadline, which is a US trade publication. It said, this week at the Cannes Lions, that's the big festival of advertising, marketing, creativity, they call it, but a lot of it's technology too.
Parties,
mainly parties, that happens in June each year. Netflix and TF1 unexpectedly announced they were teaming up to stream all 5 of the French giant's channels on the streamer, while making more than 30,000 hours of programming available on demand. The landmark agreement is the equivalent of NBC or another major American commercial network handing over its output to Netflix. In a local context, it would be TVNZ.
Yes, of course.
I mean, this just feels enormous, right? Benedict Evans, who's probably my favorite commentator on technology and media, said, this reminds me a tiny bit of Borders outsourcing online to Amazon. And it does have a little bit of that ring about it.
This is enormous. And we'll get into the detail. Clear winner here being Netflix. I'll say that at the outset. But
agree.
If you are TF1, and they are, let's just remind ourselves, France's biggest broadcaster, major shareholder, major telecommunication company, and not short of resource, undergoing all the same pressure everyone else is, possibly not quite at the same pace, but recognising the future and going, you know what, if we want to build a long tail of engagement on our broadcast platforms, we've got to find a different way of reaching that audience. The audience is increasingly going to Netflix as being the platform. We've talked on this show before about Netflix being in the category of one of becoming the new kind of acronym for television. So Netflix will no doubt be paying some form of distribution fee to bring the content from TF1 onto Netflix. So all their channels are going to be broadcast live on the Netflix platform, as well as the catch-up on-demand content.
And that's new for Netflix, right?
Never done before.
They've done some live one-off events, the Paul Tyson fight last year, the Christmas NFL games, various award shows, but to have constant 24/7 live streaming of a channel, of 5 channels, and figuring out how to put that into your various technological architectures, that's a big very different situation.
Yeah, and it just strikes me as so smart for Netflix to do, because they are actually mature in the French market. They've been there for a long time. They'll still be getting growth, but it'll be on a slower growth rate than what they got obviously many years ago. But for those people that are rusted onto broadcast that are not necessarily daily Netflix users, all of a sudden they're probably going to be, and they're going to be exposed to all of the other Netflix content that sits on that platform. It's an extraordinary deal for Netflix. A little risk in here for TF1 if Netflix decide in 2 or 3 years, you know what, hey, we really enjoyed this, but it's not for us. But in the meantime, they've transferred all the viewership onto the Netflix platform.
Or just gained phenomenal amounts of data around what people actually like out of that catalogue and make them start to be a bit more judicious with the cherry picking. And there's so much in it, right? Because, if you look at, it's barely a conversation here, much as Sparta, the Screen Production Guild, would like it to be. But there's been this idea that that we need to have a lot more local content on streamers, particularly Netflix here. Well, Netflix's answer in France is now we've got everything. We've got everything live and everything that there has ever been. 30,000 hours, just a phenomenal amount. And so the kind of political argument, and in France this is really potent because it's such a nationalistic country when it comes to culture, film and television in particular. So what a profound answer it's made there. It's also clearly a pilot. Like, you don't make the deal or kind of build the technology if you don't have plans to roll this out worldwide.
100%.
And, we've talked in recent weeks about, there's people piloting, putting, whether it's production companies or channels, putting stuff on YouTube or on Spotify, and that's kind of an increasing battleground. But this is Netflix saying, hold on a second, like, we own the big black horizontal rectangle in the lounge. YouTube's obviously been doing very well there, and it's the biggest by some kind of Nielsen surveys in the US. But I think that's what it feels like to me, is increasingly saying, like, we want to win that particular distribution stranglehold. But as you say, if you from Netflix's point of view, it's a fantastic deal.
Hard to see the downside.
Really is. But if you're TF1 or TVNZ or whatever, and they will be knocking on every door in the world, that is just the Netflix strategy, then the risk involved, as much as you see that there's, money probably walks in the door here, and it's an and deal, not an or deal.
Correct.
So you can still keep working on your own properties. It wouldn't be at the expense of TVNZ Plus existing. So very, very attractive proposition in that regard. But you are in grave danger of just becoming a production company for Netflix rather than an entity in your own right.
Yeah, but maybe that's okay. Maybe
it is.
When you look down the path of investments that need to be made in terms of distribution, traditional technology, declining audiences, all the things we know ad nauseum about what's happening to broadcast TV, maybe that's okay as a trade-off. Maybe, if you can maintain your advertising sales on your existing platforms, but you're getting now increased reach because of being on Netflix, which increases your pricing, your rate card, your yield, all those types of things. Maybe that trade-off is completely okay. I would assume the way this deal works is that TF1 will remain all of their existing monetization, including the monetization on the Netflix platform, and Netflix will do ad sales around that, or perhaps they've done a deal where Netflix have outsourced their entire ad sales to TF1 to add, further synergy into this deal. But it is going to be, in the short term, a growth strategy for TF1. They're going to grow an audience and they're going to increase their monetization capability, no question. But yeah, as you say, what does that mean in the future? Those production companies that get excited about their productions being on Netflix as well as being on TF1, potentially the incremental funding that might come through, that has incredible implications for the likes of the New Zealand market.
Yeah, absolutely. So to be clear, this has only been announced in France so far, and it's one of those things where you kind of sense just the Anglo-centric nature of the news market and particularly media news, because were this to have been, England is a fairly similar kind of scale market to France. If it had been there with a BBC or an ITV, it feels like it would have been a far bigger international story than it has ended up being, just because there's a bit of a kind of a language barrier, and we're not as familiar with TF1, clearly not as familiar with TF1 as a brand. But what it augurs for the world is enormous. And if there's one company that has the ability to kind of execute on this at a global scale, I think their share price has more or less doubled over the past year. That just gives them so much fuel to just go out and pick off broadcasters around the world. And because, unlike a lot of internet-based markets, you have real competition in most markets. So if they come to you locally, even if you're TVNZ and you say, actually, I'm not sure about this from a strategic point of view of what we give up, they can have the same conversation with Three or with Sky, or, there's real competition there. So there's a, who moves first kind of who blinks element to this as well.
Well, there's two interesting things in the local context here for me. And again, we need to emphasise this is France only. And so we're speculating around what they might do around the world. But one is, given pending regulation of platforms like Netflix and the global platforms around the world, this is a neat way to skirt around, geopolitics aside, this is a neat way to skirt around any of those pitfalls in territories like France, because their argument quite simply back to the local parliamentarians is, hey, we are investing in this company, we are putting money into the local content, and we are distributing, those stories.
It feels very far-sighted in that respect, right? Because you've got, there are a lot of companies, big tech companies right now, who look at Trump in the White House, who's basically staring down anyone who tries to tax or regulate them. You just saw this week with Canada rescinding its 3% digital services tax in response to the retaliatory tariffs. So, Netflix could have been forgiven to say, actually, the local content argument's over for the next 3.5 years. We'll just kind of sit back and count our money. But I think what they're doing, the EU does actually seem to have the heft to resist that and has its own, much more muscular regulatory kind of response to technology. But I don't think this is just about the EU. I think this is actually Netflix taking a longer view of its position and how it interacts with with competition, with potential competitors. And so this is an opportunity for us to scoop everything up. The interesting thing will be, right, like if you're France's second biggest network, which I must confess I don't know, like, is this exciting for you because there's a financial opportunity, or is this actually really scary in terms of entrenching like the dominant player that Netflix isn't likely to go down the chain? And if you were thinking about in Australia, for example, might do them with Nine and maybe the ABC, but is it going to keep going and do it again with Seven or let alone like an SBS? And you sort of go, there are dangers of being left out of this thing as well as going into it.
I think everyone who is not part of this deal will be terrified. If you think about the drivers of, economic drivers of a broadcaster, they are audience number one and the ability to monetize that audience number two. This is a net win for TF1 on both fronts, and that's going to take money away from others. So I think everyone will be quite terrified. And as I say, the ability for the production community or for TF1 to access more formats from that production community because they've got the heft of Netflix behind them means that there's less and less contestable formats for the others to fight over, and they're going to start to get the best ones. So the ramifications, kind of any area of the business you go into, just go further and further and further in favour of TF1. Incredible. And by the way, even though this is only an experiment right now, and let's just pretend the existing geopolitics of the world don't exist, it only takes one trial for them to be able to put pressure on the likes of New Zealand government to go, hey, don't think about levies or these other things. We've got this model. Let's wait and see what happens. Do you know what I mean? It delays.
So true.
It delays everything. The other interesting thing for me with TVNZ is, should this conversation happen or be happening, we don't know. But it's interesting, TVNZ obviously on a very strong digital-first transformation strategy right now. The government have probably had a look at whether or not they can sell the asset or not and decided, no, we have to kind of keep it for now, transform it, get the dividend back. This will certainly strengthen the government's view that actually the path to dividend might be stronger if a deal like this was done, and give TVNZ much greater longevity and ability to make that transformation than if they weren't, to do a deal like this.
Yeah, it all does depend on the terms of the deal and how, obviously, Netflix is a giant global operator, but its individual scale in local markets, particularly as an advertising platform, is still relatively, compared to the scale of the balance of the TV industry in individual countries, isn't. Its globalized nature is what gives it its formidable power. So there's, is it as much? We just don't know the terms of the deal and how meaningful it is financially, because but I mean, it just in terms of the this sort of scope and the optics and what it implies potentially, just a massive thing.
Well, the way these deals typically work with when a company will try to sell channels onto a pay TV network, so I'm thinking, which is a distribution deal, which is not dissimilar to this.
Yep.
The channels are paid for on what's called a CPS basis, so cost per subscriber. So however many subscribers are, cents on the dollar, they pay for that channel. That aggregates pretty quickly for the providers of those channels. And so I wouldn't think Netflix would want to reinvent the world too much. There's an existing model that exists out there in the world to be able to do these types of things. The question will be, what rights do they have? And there is an interesting IP question here around a local production that's sold to TF1 for local distribution. Now it has the potential for global distribution with Netflix. A lot of those rights negotiations have to change with TF1 and their production company.
Yeah, there's a lot that will be kind of contestable, I suppose you'd say.
And I think they've said 2026 when this is going to be live, and I think it's because there's a bit of time to work through some of the technical.
The lawyers will be working long and hard and earning their money through this. So the second story on the kind of distribution side is smaller but also kind of instructive. So across the channel in the UK, Sky, ITV and Channel 4, The Guardian reports, basically going to try and create a new platform where a single advertiser can self-service buy onto all of their channels, both digital and potentially elsewhere as well, and to try and give themselves a unified brand, which can kind of compete against Google and Meta in particular. Not for big advertisers, they're always on the schedule. They're thinking about it for small to medium-sized business advertisers, which I know that TVNZ has been thinking about in a local context as well. Basically, how can, whether it's pause screens or sort of more geo-targeted campaigns, can we create a simple video advert that can, go to a targeted audience and start to kind of compete for the kinds of dollars that just naturally get soaked up by search and social at the moment.
Yes, the potential welcome back CAPEX version 2.0.
This is the thing that's really sort of interesting and potentially frustrating for local operators around it, is that this has local precedent. So, I mean, was MediaWorks part of CAPEX?
Yep.
Yeah, so do you want to just explain what it was? Because it's sort of before my time as a media reporter, but it comes up a lot as this thing that could have been a contender.
Should have been a contender. I think go back to 2015, possibly 2016 when it was formed. It was NZ Herald, Stuff, MediaWorks, TVNZ came together as shareholders to form a programmatic digital trading platform with a view to compete with the global, so to collectively have enough scale that they could compete with a Google or a Netflix or others. Did pretty well. There were a lot of issues in trying to work out, or challenges early days, work out what inventory do we put in versus what do we keep back for ourselves, etc. Complicated by different trading deals that existed with different companies and advertising agencies and things. So there was a bit to work through. But once people got to know the system, it started to work pretty well, and it became the fastest growing revenue channel actually for the company at the time. And then, unfortunately, for whatever reason, one of the shareholders decided to pull out, and it lost that critical mass of scale. And when it lost that scale, other companies, the other shareholders had to start to make other decisions around what they did. So it never went further, and I think it shut down in 2019.
I think it was 2019. Yeah. And it's interesting, right? Because you do think about it a lot as whether it's media agencies or just businesses of all scale. Like it's so easy to buy, and the sort of seductive power of the reporting and the last click attribution that goes along with the sort of big technology advertising platforms. It can feel like they're the only options. And what this is trying to do in the UK is say, well, can we get some of the the benefits of or what they use to sell, the accessibility, the targeting, the reporting, the analytics, and apply that over our surfaces too. And if it's good enough for them, you do sort of go, what did we lose when we lost that in a local context? Because in a smaller market, it feels even, and in truth, like probably a more fragmented market, especially on a head of population basis, it needs that even more so.
Well, there's a bunch of reasons I love this thinking. One is I hate seeing in a small market like New Zealand, the media companies duplicate cost and investment in areas where if they came together, had a consolidated investment, they'd actually possibly have a better product to market. So it makes a lot of sense in that respect. The vast majority of business in New Zealand are small to medium businesses. Everyone knows that. If you look at the advertising, number of advertising customers that sit on, call it TVNZ3 or Sky, the customer base is probably somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 customers. That's it, that are regular television advertisers. So there's this huge long tail of advertisers that need to be reached. And if they can be reached with a product that's really user-friendly for them to engage and buy, and they can have, dare I say it, some form of artificial intelligence or assistance in the creative that needs to play in that digital platform.
Yeah, that's the other big barrier that exists, right? Is what are you going to put there?
Yep. But, not really a barrier anymore with artificial intelligence. And so if that can be solved, that can serve a very long tail. The challenge with this stuff is, Duncan, as much as that, I absolutely applaud them for doing this in the UK and wish them every success. Just 2 weeks ago, I listened to Mark Zuckerberg do an address where he talked about the fact they were doubling down on advertising, making more and more AA tools available to their advertising customers to make that product better, more seamless, greater attribution, all of those things. And so it feels like this is the right move, but the market is also moving forward several steps ahead at the same time. Yeah,
and I think that's the issue is it could be the right move that needed to happen 8 years ago.
Yeah.
As it did, luckily, funnily enough. The JC Billboard Network delivers quality reach via commanding sites to ensure your campaign is visible and impactful. With superior screen quality and premium locations, JC can help your campaign be seen and be remembered. Visit www.beseenberemembered.co.nz to learn more. But speaking of AI, let's move into what we've got here is a couple of stories which are sort of more in the, whoa, this is moving fast and suddenly everywhere front. And then there's finally if you're kind of sick of / just anxious about the kind of AI proliferation, please do stick around, because there's also a sort of a hint of what might prove, if not a resistance, at least a kind of a form of value attribution change, which could conceivably at least stabilize the current relationship between the sort of technology and the things that it sort of feeds on. We'll start with, this is a report from Sherwood, which quotes heavily from the Substack Garbage Day. It said in May, 4 of the top 10 YouTube channels with the most subscribers featured AI-generated material in every video. Not all the channels are using the same AI programs, and there are indications that some contain human-made elements, but none of these channels has ever uploaded a video that was made entirely without AI, and each has uploaded a constant stream of videos, which is crucial to their success. So, and what the story goes on to kind of discuss is the fact that AI-based videos, or where AI is the sort of clearly part of them, if not the whole of them, at the start of this year they were almost a curiosity. They would be shared because of the fact of there being AI rather than them being interesting in and of their own right. They were barely visible in terms of the most subscribed to channels, the highest growth channels in YouTube at the start of the year. 4 months later, there is this sort of explosive growth. The caveat that I would make with this, and the story doesn't really kind of dwell on it, but I do think it's material that the biggest growth and the most kind of engagement with them is in shorts and it's in kids' content. That doesn't mean that it isn't coming for everywhere else, but I feel that feels like the right place to start, where you have potentially a less discerning audience, or where the kind of some of the tells of AI generation, or the kind of animated styles just most naturally fit.
Yeah, it talks to me around just where video AI capability is at right now. A few seconds to a few minutes is as good as it really gets right now, without putting a lot more cost into the production. So it seems like the right place to be. I watched a couple of the top channels. One was on Shorts. I thought it was terrible, clearly directed at kids, but just for me, the production quality, it was so obviously fake. You know what I mean? It just didn't seem good to me.
It's interesting, right? Because there were some other markers with these which were a little bit suspicious. They had relatively low engagement. You come across YouTube videos quite frequently where there's some kind of ratio happening, whether it's comments, likes, there's just something and the relationship between those and views. And the thing is, if you're using AI generation on your videos, you're saving a lot of content creation things, which you can then money, which you can then pour into artificially boosting it into various feeds, which will give it the appearance of. And certainly, you could, if you were doing this as an investment story,
successful content. Right?
Well, we've cracked this amazing code. You just need to find one or two credulous investors, and you can get away on that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that this, the apocalypse is here, but it is quite telling that the platforms will change. And I think you were saying you had an interview with the YouTube CEO where they were sort of talking about the fact that they want the tools baked into it. And you mentioned as well, like, that labeling isn't really there, so it's just going to keep getting into certain spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder. I mean, clearly, much of the viewership is I say fake viewership, but mainly because Duncan, you just alluded to, they're using the money they're not spending on production to boost viewership, so it's not true engagement. But I mean, I watched a lot of the videos because I was really interested to go, where is AI at? And I just wonder how many people are out there, because this is very obviously AI, how many people out there are doing the same, which is also boosting the viewership.
Yep.
I did watch another one of the channels, which was a gosh, I can't even believe I'm saying this. It's like a remake of an 80s MTV video channel with songs, but all of the songs were AI generated and all of the images for the music videos were AI generated. That was really good. I felt like it was songs I'd heard growing up in my youth. It was really, really, really credible.
I mean, that's the interesting thing, right? Like, your expectations are very much governed by what is sort of typical within a space and the sort of feedstock of AI, how kind of contained or controllable that is. So within music, sadly for musicians, though, I think that there are going to be various fightbacks on that front there, which we might get into. You can just, it's sort of trivial for any unscrupulous AI company to go and get some giant tranche of popular music of some indeterminate period of time, and you should be able to get a model that can kind of feed out something that's pretty plausible. There was a period, call it maybe a couple of years ago, where they were sort of interesting as a thing that can happen, but not good or fun to listen to. The thing that's changing now, and this is sort of gets into the second story, is that there's this band called The Velvet Sundown, which has released 2 albums in the last month, has no presence really to speak of outside of Spotify, certainly hasn't played a show. I think it would struggle to.
No social media, no digital presence, no website, no nothing.
Yeah. But they've got 550,000 listeners and climbing, monthly listeners and climbing on Spotify. They seem to be, because that's the primary platform where people, most people engage with music, and it has its own sort of set of algorithms which juice distribution once it starts to get some popularity. And same dynamic as YouTube, you've got the ability to pay to increase that distribution. This is almost gets to the tension, is that if your cost of production goes to zero, then everything that you might normally spend to make the thing, you can spend to promote the thing. So that the AI generated music or video has a built-in advantage over anything made by humans. What will be interesting is how humans will respond to the fact that these, what are Spotify and YouTube are now user-generated content platforms. How will people respond to an ever-increasing percentage of what they're served, especially on a sort of forced serve and an ad payola kind of serve model being AI generated? Whether there's a reaction against that. Personally, I have so little interest in listening to AI generated music that beyond just what is the current state of it, that I would I'd recoil against it. But I don't know if I'm typical in that regard because I've got such a close connection to music.
Out of the 550,000 listeners, listener of one, because I did listen to Velvet Sundown, and let me tell you that, first of all, this kind of weird, knowing that it's AI, listening to this kind of late 70s, early 80s kind of vibe of music was really interesting. The first song, I was like, oh, yeah, this is pretty good, actually. I can get this. And it's got all of the kind of, I'm terrible at describing music, Duncan, but it's got all the features of music back in that era that, I recognize.
Yep.
10 songs in, I'm like, I am sick and tired of hearing the same song but a slightly different version of it, 10 songs in, because it just cannot, clearly the prompts have gone in to create a certain vibe and style of music, but it can't iterate too far from that.
Yeah, and it won't leave that.
Yeah, yeah.
So again, and there's been a lot of coverage of this artist because they look like this weird uncanny valley band, but there's just so many artists that have made less of an attempt to be a band as such, which we understand in a very human way, that are more kind of compositional, produced, production type music, which have 1 million monthlies or more. So it is rife, and if Spotify goes down the same route as YouTube, it starts to have more kind of creator tools baked into its platform, and you just stay in there to make the music, release the music. For the community of people who are doing the hard work of making music in other places and all of the expensive stuff of being an artist and releasing music, the idea that the place that is, where all the listening happens now is they're increasingly in competition with this. I just think that, it will be interesting to see how people respond to, whether it's artists or fans, to that encroaching phenomenon.
My theory on this, Duncan, is that we're a few years away yet from AI having the kind of capability and engine power to drive enough for us to believe or to accept it into our world as being something that we would listen to or watch every day. However, I do think that day is coming, and I think we're less than a couple of years away from seeing a major feature-length production that people will love, distributed on YouTube for free, as being a real turning point and pivot point for content creation. I think in the meantime, what you're going to see is behind these platforms, artificial intelligence used more and more and more in how are ads monetized, how are ads created, in the kind of engine room of these platforms rather than
the financial engine room rather than the creative. Yeah. So we'll kind of keep an eye on it. It's just this tremendously heady, challenging topic. But there was a very interesting kind of rejoinder. This also was announced at Cannes. That this is I'll read now from a CNBC report. It's an internet firm, Cloudflare, which basically it kind of keeps websites up. It's not a cloud provider in its own right. But I remember, for example, like a few years ago, there were, I think, like Kiwi Farms and some of the most disreputable parts of the internet. They sort of stopped providing support to, and that. So they're sort of neutral in some senses, right, except for the very margins. But they are absolutely infrastructure that everyone needs. And they've done quite a smart thing here, which is they've said they will start blocking artificial intelligence crawlers from accessing content without a website owner's permission or compensation by default. The by default is really interesting. In that previously it was something you could turn on, but you'd have to sort of think about that. In a move that could significantly impact AI developers' ability to train their models. Starting Tuesday, that's Tuesday just gone, every new web domain that signs up to Cloudflare will be asked if they want to allow AI crawlers, effectively giving them the ability to prevent bots from scraping data from their websites. The company will also allow publishers to charge AI crawlers from access using a new pay-per-crawl model. Now, there are sort of two elements to the way that AI has sort of eaten everything that has ever existed on the internet. The first is the sort of backward looking. And if you had a different moment, if this had occurred in a different moment where you had a much more sort of activist streak in government, I think there would have obviously been a desire for compensation from the sort of copyright owners to the people who are monetizing that content by other means. We don't exist in that moment, and the Trump administration in particular, which is the default world government right now, is fiercely resistant to it as against American interest and against the sort of geopolitical war with China kind of, or intellectual property war with China that's going on. But And so you've been sort of sitting in this sort of stasis, and that's the backwards-looking thing. But the forwards-looking thing is there a financial model that will encourage the creation of things, or are we just sort of sitting here waiting for the ship to go down, whether you're, a creator of... Basically, if anyone's got their own website, and this is where Cloudflare, I think, is quite an interesting piece of this because, their customers are everybody. They will start to lose customers if it becomes non-viable to host websites that are out, that are just effectively being demonetized by the rise of AI. So, this kind of cost per crawl thing, like it, given the amount of investment, just the insane fire hoses of cash that exists with the big AI companies. And given how much like news publishers in particular are if you look at any list of the most crawled websites, they're always right near the top, and how frequently they're updated. Like, you need the live information. You don't just need the backwards looking stuff. So, yeah, what did you make of that?
I had two instinctive thoughts. One was hopeful that this can get a lot more airtime and exposure than what it currently has. Like this, when you sent me the story, I'd never heard. This is the first I'd heard of it, and so it's the sort of thing I think every publisher or anyone who's on the web needs to be aware of and start thinking about. So I was hopeful in that sense, and then I had. I guess a more negative thought to go, what, the scale and speed with which these AI LLMs are moving and the amount of billions, if not trillions of more data points they're adding every day to train these models, the volume of that seems really difficult to overcome on a small scale, as good as that intent is. Like, this is something that needs a true, dare I say, global type response, or at least the EU, for example, to stand up and go, what, we like this, we're going to, execute something like this, for it to really get hold and to then change the dynamics in the future for publishers.
Yeah, because I mean, right now you've seen a few publishers, Vox, The Atlantic. I think the New York Times is both suing OpenAI and has a deal with
Yeah.
Amazon. So if you're a big publisher, or largely if you're a US-based publisher, you've got a shot at making a deal, which kind of provides you some compensation in return for access. With everyone else, they're just taking it. That's broadly what it sort of comes down to. So the deals are essentially cosmetic. They're sort of PR based. There might be some value. Maybe if say you do something with Bloomberg and you look at, they've got a lot of proprietary financial information. But for
News Corp in Australia did a deal too, I think.
Yeah, I think they might have done a global deal. Yeah, but they're sort of piece by piece. This sort of implies a sort of a default global kind of deal with Cloudflare being a sort of intermediary there. We just have to see whether. I mean, the other thing is, I guess that sort of, I don't know, makes me like the kind of the part of me that just thinks that these people aren't particularly interested in what the right thing to do is that that currently they're accessing this by crawling, and they're walking in the front door and announcing they're a crawler. Like the sort of it feels like there are a lot of ways to skin this cat technologically, and if they have to figure out a workaround for the sites that they care about to keep getting that information for free, then they'll just do it. And that's kind of, that feels like the power dynamic right now is that they have the power, they have the money, and anyone who's got a site that they don't want to be monetized that way, even if Cloudflare provides them some additional layers of protection, the warfare is asymmetric.
Yeah, I think the risk for a lot of publishers, particularly smaller publishers out there, or digital content providers, we're not just talking news publishers here, is that there's a level of complacency to go, you know what, they can scrape my content, we're doing fine, we're kind of monetizing it over here. And whilst it might seem okay to think that way today, the challenge with AI is we haven't seen the new digital products that are going to be created in the future yet, leveraging that information that exists today from others. And so we haven't necessarily, and they're starting to pop up, but that's how Google partly came in by stealth. They became, the search engine for the world, but off the back of that search engine, the products they built started to strip money from other ecosystems, and that's the kind of beware all of you sign.
Yeah, it's the slow drip of it, right? That initially they might have the appearance of a friendly, or at the very least, of a huge interest to a single-digit percentage, but our traffic flows at the spin-off, for example, don't seem to be radically altered by it yet. Not nearly so much as the end of social distribution has impacted us, for example. But we just haven't seen the kind of wave upon wave of baking into existing products and new competing products being built.
I also have a contrary view that I think there's a lot of area of opportunity for publishers by utilizing AI and certainly non-core, non-editorial parts of their offering. I think about live events, whether, people are doing it in business today. There are areas of the kind of news cycle where I think there's an opportunity to leverage AI in a hyper-local way in terms of the product that's going to be really compelling and be genuinely additive to the editorial strategy.
Yeah, and while there's been a little bit of that locally, I mean, Business Desk did the automation of market reports, for example. That still, it feels like it's more on the AI controls my homepage rather than AI is creating kind of versions of commodity news type thing. It's almost surprising the extent to which that hasn't happened. Many places I've looked, I don't know whether that's a sort of an internal resistance or whether it's harder than it looks. But there does seem to be opportunity out there for genuine public interest AI use cases.
Traditional TV networks partnering with Netflix, their biggest rival, sounds crazy, right? But what's even more mind-blowing is that AI-generated content is now getting millions of streams on Spotify and YouTube.
That's fascinating how these traditional networks are essentially admitting they can't compete alone anymore. What made them finally cave?
Well, the numbers tell the story. Netflix's global reach of over 230 million subscribers is just too tempting to ignore. These networks realized they could either adapt or become irrelevant.
And now we're seeing this same kind of disruption with AI content creation. Some of these AI songs are getting millions of plays.
You know what's really interesting? Industry experts are predicting that by next year, AI could generate up to 30% of all new content on major platforms. We're talking about this massive shift in how media is created and distributed.
So you're saying we're basically watching the entire media landscape transform in real time?
Exactly. And here's the kicker. These platforms are scrambling to figure out how to handle attribution and compensation. Like, how do you fairly pay an AI versus a human creator? It's completely uncharted territory.
That's going to have huge implications for creative industries.
And the most fascinating part, viewers and listeners might not even realize they're consuming AI-generated content. We're entering this era where the line between human and machine creativity is becoming increasingly blurred.
So that actually wasn't Glen and Duncan. We tasked Glen, or Glen tasked himself rather, with trying to get to see what the sort of state of and the accessibility of AI was, and sort of set up the pair of us introducing the next portion of the podcast, and that was what the system. The system spat out. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's fair to say that I took a cheap path to market, Duncan. Basically what I did is I went into ChatGPT. When you go into ChatGPT, there is a number of products that use ChatGPT off to the side. So I went through all of their podcasting products, found one that could clone our voices, write a script, and produce a podcast, and that's what you've just heard. And it did take a few hours to get it right, but to be honest, it's the first time I've done it. Now that I know, it would probably take 10 minutes. And, you know, this is the world. And increasingly, what's interesting to me is I'm hearing more and more corporate brands create their own podcast to have their own distribution strategy. You know, it doesn't seem long before that becomes completely automated with AI.
Yeah, absolutely. So up to you whether you prefer the AI or the genuine article. We will, if you're a genuine article type, we'll be here.
Hopefully
next week. We're not transferring it to the robots anytime soon. Seeing is not enough. With optimized data tools and insights, the JC2Co Billboard Network helps brands be remembered. Dedicated to closing the loop between impression and action, JC2Co can help your campaign be seen and be remembered. Visit www.beseenberemembered.co.nz to learn more.